familiar with the Church of Scientology at all, in 1977, they got busted by the FBI because the Church of Scientology, the Sea organization, had directed and overseen the infiltration of the United States government at a level that has not been repeated since by an internal domestic organization.
Except for Russia.
Right. No, I mean physically. I mean, they were literally physically in the IRS. They were in government installations. In fact, they got busted because what they were trying to do, okay, in 1974, L. Ron Hubbard got sick and tired of living on the ocean all the time and not having a safe port, not having a safe place to be. And he was really, really sick of it, right? So he developed what he called Operation Snow White, or the Snow White program. And this was a series of targets that were supposed to result in his good name being restored in the various government offices of the world. And remember, they'd been accumulating files on this guy since 1950, because he had been sending them crazy ass letters and stuff like that, right? I mean, he created all of his own trouble. And it was true that they were monitoring his activities, but they were doing it because he was breaking the law left, right, and center. So he gets to the point where he gets kind of fed up with this. He's got this group of hardcore followers who will do anything he tells them to do. And he had also set up a parallel structure under the control of Mary Sue, his wife, which was called the Guardian's Office. Now, this was not a Sea Org outfit, but its sole purpose was spying and infiltration, as well as public relations. It has now been renamed and rebranded as the Office of Special Affairs, or OSA. But at the time, in the 70s, it was the GO, or the Guardian's Office. So you had the GO and you had the Sea Org. Now, they were kind of a little bit, in competition with each other, but Mary Sue was over the GO, Hubbard was over the Sea Org, and the idea was that the GO was going to go into these government installations and they were going to clean the files. They were going to literally get rid of all the nasty reports about L. Ron Hubbard that the government had in its files. So they infiltrated the IRS amongst many other organizations. And this wasn't just the federal government, it was city, state governments as well, foreign and domestic. And they started trying to find what was in the files. And a guy named Gerald Wolf was one fine day in the IRS building. Actually, I think it was at night. And he was making copies of all these files, of all the stuff they had. And I'm talking about like stacks and stacks of files because they have a lot of stuff on Scientology. And he got caught because he's not an IRS employee. And yet he had a badge and he was in there and shouldn't have been. And somebody noted that. They were like, hey, you're not supposed to be in here. And they, kind of logged it. And somebody took note and he came back and tried to do it again. And they caught him. And they arrested him and he got busted. And the church immediately went into damage control. The GO went into overtime. Oh my God. And there were other people involved. And eventually, basically, what ended up happening was they raided the Los Angeles Church of Scientology, the big blue buildings. That's where I work, by the way. They raided it in 1977. The FBI had accumulated enough evidence that they went in there and said, okay, something's fishy because we caught this guy making these copies and doing this weird stuff. And he's telling weird stories and this isn't adding up. Let's go figure out what's going on. And they went in there with sledgehammers and they got file cabinets after file cabinets after file cabinets of data. And they found Hubbard's program, the Snow White program, and all this other stuff that the GO had been involved in, where they had been trying to ruin people's lives. There was a journalist named Paulette Cooper who literally had been driven almost to the point of suicide by the church's covert operations in her life because she had dared to write a book that was critical of Scientology, one of the first ones. So they tried to ruin her life. All of this came out in the files, right? She was like literally going nuts, and she was being prosecuted by the law because the church had set her up as a patsy, or not a patsy, but as a person who had written in bomb threats against the police or something, and so they had busted her. Turns out the church had set her up. on purpose because they wanted to ruin her utterly, exactly according to Hubbard's policies. So this all comes out in this raid. 11 Scientologists, including Mary Sue Hubbard, went to jail.
It also says they raided the Washington, D.C. office, but that's not super important.
No, I mean, all the pictures come out of L.A., but yeah, it was a big raid. Yeah. And they got so much data. I mean, you FOIA request this stuff, and it's just stacks and stacks of documents.
But Mary Sue got sent to prison, man.
Yes, it was a huge bust. And of course, okay, so to summarize, L. Ron Hubbard, of course, threw her under the bus. And she went to jail. She took responsibility. Hubbard was an unindicted co-conspirator, and not one of those 11 people confessed that L. Ron Hubbard had anything to do with what had been going on. So he was kept separated. His own wife, Mary Sue, went to jail for him. And they had 2-year prison sentences, I think. This was a huge, huge PR nightmare for the church. And of course, they flipped the script and tried to make it all about how, it was all huffed up, puffed in, and it was just a religious persecution and blah, blah, blah. But none of that was true. The church had gotten caught red-handed. As a result of this, there was a major reorganization and shakeup within the church. There were other actions that occurred too, which I really can't easily explain. But basically, there was a structural reorganization of the entire church. And this all occurred in the early 1980s, and it changed over to the structure that it is now, where it is a labyrinth of corporations, one over another. It's very, very difficult legally to separate out how all of this is put together. And it was done for purposes of plausible deniability and separation of the corporation. So if one goes down, another one is still there to operate. So they actually brought on board the best tax accountants and corporate accountants and legal minds that they could hire to advise them on how to structure this whole thing so that L. Ron Hubbard and his name and his estate would always be completely protected and kept separate from all this other stuff that the church engages in. And because they haven't stopped doing the stuff I was just describing that they got busted for. They still do that crap. But they just do it in such a way that they're way more sneaky about it. And they have more layers of plausible deniability because they hire it out to contractors and private investigators and stuff, and instead of having Scientologists do their dirty work so much these days.